Today I'll be making the case for Vagabond as the best manga of all time. Now, the important thing to know here is that this isn't the heavyweight belt. There's no definitive answer, there's no outright winner. And that's the point of this video. I'm going to give my reasoning and why I think that Vagabond has the most substantial claim to that title. Without wasting any time, let's go ahead and get into the plot and overall narrative structure. The story for this manga is incredibly simple, but the beauty is in the details. If you really wanted to oversimplify it, you could just say that this manga is about a man trying to become the strongest. But of course, in Vagabond's execution, it's so much deeper than this. And that's best shown through characters and the themes intertwined with those characters. But before we get into that, I want to talk about how phenomenally this narrative is structured. Vagabond could have easily been a very messy story. It does have a pretty large cast, a lot of switching perspectives, you have some flashbacks and glimpses into the future. And the truth is, some authors really couldn't pull this off. This could have easily been a recipe for disaster. But Takike Inoue did pull through, making the pacing almost flawless. And that's one of Vagabond's biggest accomplishments. The pages and paneling is so fluid, it makes it such an easy read. But while I do love the plot and how well this manga was paced, what really captured me was the characters and the themes involved with those characters. There's of course our main character Musashi, which you can just take so many endless lessons from really. The one that stood out to me the most, and I think is most relevant throughout the entire story, his story specifically, is his journey with self-control. It's something that he doesn't really have at the beginning, and it's something that he masters by the end. And it's not something that happens right away. You see him constantly struggling with self-control as the series goes on. You see everything, his setbacks, his strides forward, and his stumbles along the way. And it's one of the reasons why I think he's the best manga protagonist of all time. But there are other side protagonists that get a lot of shine in the story, one of which is Matahachi. And using shine is a little bit too generous, I'd say a lot, but with his story, it's pretty much a downward spiral. He parallels Musashi's character arc perfectly. Musashi's character arc is definitely positive, it's trending upwards pretty much 24/7, while Matahachi, he's in a downward spiral. We see in the Takezo arc, the first arc of the series, that he makes a crucial bad decision, and that's of course to leave every single person that ever cared about him. And of course, that's a pretty shitty thing to do, and not only that, it just didn't really seem that smart given the whole situation that they were in. The next time we see him, he is a complete fuck up. He comes from a very rich family, a very well-off and privileged family, but now he's pretty much living on the streets. And I'm not going to run through his entire character arc, but basically he just keeps making bad and worse decisions. But he's not all bad. He does have his redeeming qualities, and at times, especially there in the Ashioka arc, he does make right decisions. And I did mention glimpses into the future before. This is done with Matahachi. Vagabond does have the tendency to make the very old, wise mentor character, and this does essentially happen with Matahachi as well, and somehow they make it very believable. If you're going to give an example of Inoue's fantastic character writing, there's no better example than Matahachi himself. But not everything's perfect, and I think this is where Otsu comes into play. Because the manga never finished, her character never finished. And while I do think I have a good idea of where her character arc was going and how it was going to end, there's no real way to be sure, and so I don't really think it works that well as an excuse. But she did always represent the idea of something that Musashi could have. He could give up on being a warrior and settle down and have a good family with Otsu. But just knowing the real life history of Musashi, he never took a wife or had any kids, so we know that's not going to happen. Like I said, I think I have a good idea of where her character arc was going, but unfortunately it's something we never got to see, and I do see that as a flaw on the series. But when it comes to Vagabond, while those flaws do exist, there's so many other phenomenal aspects that overshadow that flaw. And while I do think that there's a little bit of flaw to be seen in Otsu, I think that the phenomenal cast of antagonists that we have in this series overshadow her without a doubt. Now there is 6 of these guys, so I'm going to go in chronological order and try and go pretty fast. The first antagonist I'm going to be talking about is Inshun. He is essentially the complete opposite of Musashi. If Musashi is a yin, Inshun is a yang. My favorite aspect of their conflict is the fact that each character comes to complete each other. Musashi doesn't yet really know it, but what he needs is self-control, something that Inshun has in spades. And on the opposing end, Inshun needs a life or death experience to complete complete his journey as a warrior, something that Musashi has done time and time again. This dynamic does set a high bar of expectation for the later fights in the series, and luckily in my opinion they all at least live up to that expectation. And giving a great example of living up to that expectation is the next antagonist, and that has to be Baiken. And while Shun and Musashi are polar opposites, I would say that Baiken and Musashi are direct parallels. Even going down to the name change, Musashi used to be Shinmen Takeizo, and Baiken used to be Tsuchikaze Kohei. Of course, it's not just the name change, it's not nearly that shallow. Musashi was a demon child in the mountains, while Baiken was a heartless bandit even at a young age. And the similarities really do start to stack up. I'd say their development is pretty much the same, at least in terms of quality, and that's all within the same amount of time. Then there's also the contributing factors to their development. Musashi got humbled by Shun, which immensely developed his character. With Baiken, it was pretty much the same situation, except that the person that humbled him was Sasaki Kojiro. And while Takeizo does always have Otsu to keep him level, with Kohei, it's the former Baiken's alleged daughter. With all that being said, I think that this fight is without a doubt the most emotionally impactful. And that's pretty crazy because up next we have the Yashioka clan. And in this, I'm going to go ahead and talk about all three heads. Them of course being Seijiro, Denshi Chido, and Ueda. Now, out of all of these, Seijiro has always been the one that I considered the most interesting. His character has always been so mysterious, and when we finally do learn the secret to his character, it makes him so much more compelling. But before learning that secret during his fight with Musashi, there's no real reason to root for him. Sure, he's always been charismatic and entertaining, but why would we ever root for him over Musashi? And then the reveal happened, and this made Seijiro the character with the most noble goal in the entire series. Musashi was essentially killing to prove his strength, while at the same time Seijiro, he was killing to protect his family. He did all of this in solitude, hidden behind a thick wall of stoicism. And just to add a little bit of icing on the feels bad cake, Seijiro was in the middle of doing exactly what Tak 1 was trying to get Musashi to. Seijiro had already married Akemi, while Musashi couldn't even decide what he wanted to do with Otsu. And while I do think that Baiken versus Musashi is a little bit more impactful on an emotional level, this fight still hits really hard. And it doesn't stop there. It continues throughout the entire arc because next up we have Denshi Chido, and he constantly struggles with inferiority towards his older brother. And given how talented Seijiro is, it's not hard to see why that happens, but it's because of that he never really finds any sort of self-control. And while Seijiro versus Musashi was not only a good fight on an emotional level, but on a physical level as well, it was really close and it could have gone either way. But Musashi versus Denshi Chido really didn't turn out this way. It was one of the easiest fights Musashi's ever had, especially when it comes to one of the bigger fights, but it does lead to one of the best send-offs for a character, and that would be Denshi Chido's death. In his final moments, Denshi Chido's theme comes full circle. He had always felt inferiority to everybody, especially Seijiro, his older brother. But by the end, Denshi Chido had finally overcome that inferiority. And that leads us to the last one, Ueda. I believe that Seijiro and Ueda have very similar themes. It's both loyalty in my opinion. One's to family and one is to the clan. But the execution is very different because Seijiro was doing it to protect and Ueda is doing it for revenge. But this is essentially Ueda's last stand, whether or not he wins or loses. If he loses, of course he dies, but if he wins, he's the leader of an aimless Yashioka clan. But as we know, he ends up being one of the first ones to die. The Yashioka clan had a pretty genius idea where they were going to tire Musashi out with a lot of the weaker members, and then by the time he gets to Ueda, he's too exhausted and he ends up getting cut down. But unfortunately for them, the opposite ends up happening. Ueda is the first one cut down, and then after that, it's the most skilled to the least skilled. But I think it's very important to mention, I only mentioned things in the Yashioka arc. What makes Ueda such a fantastic antagonist is the buildup that he gets in both the Kyoto and Kojiro arcs. But speaking of Kojiro, that's the final antagonist I wanted to talk about. Now, unfortunately, we never really see him play the role of antagonist towards Musashi in the story just because we never really got that far, but he's always set up to be that. I mean, he is Miyamoto Musashi's most famous rival, and what makes his setup as fantastic as a amazing as it is the fact that he actually played the role of protagonist for a little bit. The Kojiro arc is always about him. It never really takes his direct perspective, and the more I think about it, the more I think it's such a fascinating way to tell a story. Kojiro is a character that can't hear or speak, so really everything we learn about his character is through facial expressions or things other characters say about him. And Kojiro seems to possess something that Musashi is actively working towards 24/7. Musashi can and has been very rigid at times, but in the battle with the Yashioka clan, he's telling himself to be more like water, have no form. And with Kojiro, this is something that's referenced almost an endless amount of times. But there's so many themes to Kojiro as a character, and like I said, it's fascinating because we never get his true perspective. In a sense, in Fear, things they get explored, but we never see exactly what he thinks. These are just some of the reasons why I think that Kojiro should always be in talks to have the title of #1 antagonist in all of manga. Now, the art is definitely what Vagabond is most known for. The realistic style lends itself so well to the historical setting. With Vagabond, you're going to get undebatably some of the best two-page spreads of all time, and the consistency of his artistic style is almost unheard of. The consistency does start to fade a little bit towards the end of the series, kind of during the farm arc and whatnot, but even then I would never call that artwork bad. If I had to make broad overgeneralizations, I'd say if you're one of the people that's read any of Takehiko Inoue's works, I'm talking Vagabond, or Real, or Slam Dunk, even if Takehiko Inoue's art isn't your favorite of all time, it has to be top 5. In 2002, Vagabond won the Tezuka Osamu Cultural Prize, as well as the Kodansha Manga Award in 2000, and this looks real nice with the 82 million copies sold worldwide. And while I don't believe awards and copies sold makes the series great, I don't really think it works against me. Overall, I tried my best to make the case for Vagabond as the best manga of all time. Make sure to let me know how you think I did.